This is a story about stories, about how the simple act of talking can reorganize a person's life. This is actually my story. Usually I come here in this space to tell you someone else's story, to hear what influenced them, where their life and work intersect. Today, I'm here to tell you about how these conversations have influenced my work. There really is no way to do this many episodes and not come out changed somehow. I look at some of the great podcast interviewers of the day, Mark Maron, Terry Gross, and I marvel at how they manage to sustain that intense curiosity over literally thousands of encounters. But I get it, too. It's like an addiction, really, and 7 years of cranking out episodes will do something to a person. I remember when I published my first episode, back in January 2014. It was a conversation with bassist Will Lee. Will came over to my house to do an interview for a podcast that didn't even exist yet, and he was so generous with me, so enthusiastic. But after it was recorded, it sat, unpublished, for over a month. I knew that once I let that cat out of that bag and proclaimed to the world that I was now a podcaster, there would be no going back for me. And I was right, there was no going back. For nearly 200 episodes, I've started each podcast by saying these same words every time. Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Even before I decided to launch the podcast, I did a handful of practice interviews with friends just to get a sense of what to expect, to see if I was any good at it, if it was worth pursuing. The first person I talked to was the trumpet player Tatum Greenblatt, and I still remember a lot about that conversation today. For example, I remember that he talked about native language acquisition, how learning music is like learning a language, and if you grow up in a house where that language is being spoken already, you might be more inclined to understand it. That interview came out eventually on the podcast, but there were also a few ill-fated attempts that never saw the light of day, like the one I did with guitar player Matt Munisteri. I remember that conversation too. We talked about Brooklyn in the 80s and how his Italian family played the old world guitar players for him. He even demonstrated a few things on the guitar, like this one. But at that point, I didn't really understand what the format of the show was supposed to be or who I was supposed to be. There were a lot of awkward pauses, I remember, and nervous laughs in that one, and I ultimately decided not to put it out. I had to learn, and I relied on my friends to help me figure it out. But from every conversation, I remember at least one significant idea. Sometimes it's personal, other times it's esoteric or technical. For example, Kurt Elling talked about overcoming impatience.
A lot of it is just knuckling under, and what's the right analogy? Man, you just got to dig harder and slow it down. Mm-hmm. Slowing stuff down is the biggest thing. You can see kind of a recurring theme here. My desire to create works of quality at a certain rate is in direct conflict with the best possible way to achieve those goals, which is to slow things down.
Becca Stevens talked about reaching into the emotional well when she's performing.
I'm like an emotional perfectionist, and emotions, like the way that you connect with your emotions and then connect them outward during performance to an audience, the search for whatever it is that I'm looking for there is infinite. So there's never an end to that. So even if it were the same song 100 times every night, it would never be the same. And depending on the mood that I'm in, or how tired I am, or the biggest influence is the energy of the room. It's never the same.
Andre DeShields talked about the uncertainties of a life in the arts.
If when you get hungry, and you most assuredly will get hungry in your pursuit of a career, if you can make a meal of rejection, and when you get lonely, and you will certainly get lonely in your pursuit of a career, if you can make a companion of insecurity, then this is the industry for you. But if the thought of eating rejection and loving insecurity frightens you in the least bit, find something else to do and leave it to those of us who know how to live perched capriciously on the precipice of the abyss.
Jorge Drexler talked about the importance of empathy in his songwriting.
I do retreat inward when I write. It's a classic inward process. Once again, retreating inward myself, for me, means also being able to go. I spent almost 2 years touring and incorporating experiences and meeting people without writing almost for 2 years. Then I go inside myself, but I myself, I'm a reflection of the other people I meet. So going inside this particular human being isn't different from going inside other human beings. I just happen to go inside myself because I have myself to do that. But everything comes from empathy. Mm-hmm. I do have the deep belief that I'm part of the human race. Go inside one human and you will be able to access to all the other humans, at least in their culture and their generation. Yeah. We have the same questions, or more or less.
Howard Levy explained how rhythm, melody, light, and time are all related.
You start looking at everything numerically and mathematically, it gets really, really interesting. And so polyrhythms and intervals are the same things at different speeds. And then if you get to the frequencies above pitch, you start getting into light. And it's, interestingly enough, if you take white light and split it up with a prism, you get 7 colors. So we have like 7 note scales all over the world, really, really common. And we have these 7 note rhythmic patterns, you know. So there's numbers that keep coinciding in the super fast vibrational speeds of light, the middle speed of pitch, and the lower speed of rhythm. And then even below rhythm, rhythm is related to body movement. If it's slower than the speed of your walking, it's hard to feel it. Then it starts getting into time, which is more abstract. You have to count it. And then you need a watch. And coincidentally, that has 12 numbers on the dial. And then if it's slower than a watch, you need a calendar, which coincidentally has 12 months. And the weeks are divided into, there's weeks of 7 days, and they have 5 weekdays and 2 weekend days, which on most people's calendars, the weekend days are half the size to make them fit on one line for non-musicians who don't work on Saturdays and Sundays. So I find this like fascinating, that these numbers just keep reoccurring. Yeah, I'm not making this up. It just keeps reoccurring through all of these different things. It's not mysticism or anything, it's empirical.
Whoa, you see what I'm saying there? John Fields told me about the importance of positive energy in the recording studio.
I just try to be stoked about what I'm doing, and I like to be around people that are like up. So I try to be that way myself.
Amy Cervini from the group Duchess talked about the value of joy when performing.
People go out to have a good time. I mean, I go out to have a good time and to be entertained sometimes. And I think that's the thing that sort of, and not with everyone, there are plenty of people out there doing it, but I think it's something that's definitely not normal right now.
Orlando Fleming talked about how being an athlete prepared him to play the bass.
Just the mental approach to getting, achieving something on a difficult instrument. Just that mentality of really figuring out what's going to get you to that point, and using the discipline of sport, and just perseverance and discipline, for sure.
Ryan Keberle talked about how manifesting his desire to work with Sufjan Stevens led him to getting his dream gig.
From my experience, like everything in my career that has kind of opened new doors, putting out positive energy and putting out, making it known that I love his music, I mean,
you were a fan.
I was a huge fan. And I knew his trumpet player, and I had a couple of very good friends who had recorded with him in the past, other trombonists. And
you knew that he was interested in trombones and working with horns.
So I let all these people know, man, if you ever need a sub, let me know. This is like my all-time favorite music. I would kill to have the opportunity to play his music someday live. And so that opportunity came to fruition, amazingly. It certainly was just right time, right place, knowing the right people. Definitely one of the highlights of my career to this point.
Ricky Peterson talked about why people from all over the world traveled to Minneapolis to work with him.
Why people come and flocked around us, too, because it was comfortable. Yeah. And we made everybody feel good, man. Yeah. It wasn't like, cracking whips. It was having fun. It was all about having fun.
Yeah.
And that's my motto. I'm not going to do it if it's not going to be any fun, man.
Anya Marina talked about the importance of laughter.
Do you prefer hearing laughter in a concert or applause?
Laughter, definitely.
Me too.
Because it means that we're having a conversation. The audience and I are experiencing something together.
And Larry Goldings talked about humor also.
I was always into making people laugh. That's how I made friends when I was little, and found that I could do that. I do have definitely a subversive. I like the subversive humor, and I do think it comes out in my playing sometimes. The context in which I got to experiment with it was when I started leading my own gigs and I had a microphone. Mm-hmm. And that's where I started to get kind of addicted to it. Like, wow, that made them laugh.
Mm-hmm. Patience, emotion, uncertainty, empathy, beauty, positivity, joy, intention, humor. These essential truths were all revealed to me just by talking. Over these years, I have come to believe in the importance of curiosity, connection, and conversation, which is a bit of a lost art. To sit in stillness with another person for an hour or more and just let the wheel roll, let the time pass, let the atmosphere adjust. It's a profound thing to do. Until last year, I always insisted that in order to do what I do, I needed to do it in the same room with another person. After all, can we really say that we're sharing the same space remotely? I don't know if this is journalism, but physically going somewhere to talk to a guest or having someone come to me always felt a little more like reporting a moment in time. And I discovered early on that interviewing people was a lot like collaborating musically. It was about actively listening. I learned that not only does everyone have their own way of expressing, but that they also have their own way of listening. So I came to see myself as a facilitator of other people's stories to help clarify the narrative. At the same time, from the very start, I got hooked on the wellspring of ideas, emotion, and creativity that I found in these conversations. And while it's a huge delight to know that these talks are meaningful to other listeners, the truth of it is that even if nobody listened, I would still want to do them because I just get so much out of it. So I think it was inevitable that at some point, some extracurricular project would grow out of the podcast. Sometimes I feel like a detective piecing together clues, unlocking universal truths, or weaving together a larger story out of the threads that I pull on. One of those tapestries, one of many that was formed out of these interviews, was performed by over 60 contributors in the form of my new record, The Art of Conversation.
The Art of Conversation. The Art of Conversation.
As is so often the case, in order to move forward, we have to look back. One of the first episodes that I did back in 2014 was with the singer-songwriter Jo Lawry. She told me about a song club that she had belonged to that helped her as a writer. The gentle accountability of her peers motivated her and kept her creative practice going.
I was really paralyzed writing-wise for a long time because I would end up writing maybe one song a year, and it used to end up being probably for an assignment for college and work its way into my repertoire, because I'm so intimidated by the blank page, and I set out trying to do something good or hopefully perfect, which you're done from the beginning when you do that. And so I wasn't really writing, and it was this one big change in my approach, which was don't try to write a good song, just try to write a song. And that changed everything. And that was pretty recent. That was only a couple of years ago. And it was partly through this, Doug Wamble encouraged me to join this song club, which was kind of spearheaded by Adam Levy. Mm-hmm. And it was this thing where they would send out a title every Sunday and you had to upload your track by Thursday. And it was just the pressure of having to produce something, and just, I really took my focus off trying to make things good, and I just wrote. And what came out really surprised me, and I was really excited by what emerged when I was more process-oriented than goal-oriented. And in actual fact, those songs for that club actually make up more than half the album that I'm making now. I never started any of them thinking they were worth a damn. Like, I would be writing something and thinking, well, this is a piece of crap, but I got to finish it because I got to upload it by Thursday.
I loved that idea, and I thought, how great would it be to have a community of people to write for, to keep each other honest, to have a reason to write. And a year later, when I interviewed musician Doug Wamble, he talked about that very same song club and how it had inspired him to write an entire album worth of material.
Adam Levy started the song club where he, you know, a lot of people have done this, but it's like, you know, he sent out a lyric, all people in his group write a song. And I mean, I did over a year, but I did 52 songs in a year. I think I was the only one who did his club complete.
Yep.
I did, I think, about 10 weeks after that before he kind of shut it down. But I wrote all these songs, and I was like, oh, this is like a whole other thing that I can do.
Do you think that the club, like, do you think you'd be able to do that without the outside stimulus of just saying, like, I'm going to write a tune a week? It's just interesting. I've talked to other people that do these song clubs, and it's kind of like they all inevitably walk out with a record written. You know, essentially say, oh, yeah, really will open me up to my own songwriting identity. And then you're sitting here with, even if half of them are good, even if a third of them are good, even if a quarter of them are good, you know, then you got an album's worth of material.
Yeah.
I've always said to myself, I don't need to join a club to write a song. But, like, maybe there is something. It's almost like applying a little bit of the good values of being in school.
Yes. It's peer review. You want to, there's competition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I said to myself when he started it, some weeks I didn't do it, some weeks I did. And then when it came time for the second edition, I was like, you know what? I'm going to see if I can do this. I was also in a point in my life where I was in a lot of transition, just going through a divorce and all this stuff that was like changing in my life, a lot of uncertainty. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to just mine this and really use it as an outlet. And it was a challenge to myself. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to see if I can do this for a year.
I can hear the wheels in my head spinning as I talk to Doug about this, and I can also hear how his personal life and his creative life met up in his songwriting. A year after that, I finally talked to Adam Levy himself about that song club, and it was a deep conversation. He told me a lot of things, like how his club had been inspired by an earlier song circle that he used to go to in the West Village, but also he talked about the existential experience of writing songs and being a songwriter.
I went through a pretty hard period. In 2009, I lost my wife, and I stopped writing songs because I was afraid of what I would write. I was afraid I was afraid to unpack that stuff in songs. So I didn't write. I was like, I'm going to shut that door for a while. And then one day I looked in the mirror, not metaphorically, but I looked in the mirror. I was brushing my teeth or something. I was like, are you a songwriter? What is a songwriter? A songwriter is somebody who writes songs. So if you're not writing songs, maybe you're not a songwriter. Mm-hmm. It was like some tough love from myself. I was like, why don't you write some freaking songs? So I was inspired by a guy who's not with us anymore, named Jack Hardy, do you know Jack?
Mm-mm.
Boy, he's a guy, people either know him and love him, or they're like,
no, I don't know. Yeah, right.
So he was part of this scene that was called the fast folk scene that Suzanne Vega came out of, this kind of late 80s singer-songwriter scene.
Mm-hmm.
And he lived in this tiny little studio apartment, and it was so old school. It was like, bathroom down the hall, like, shared bathroom, old school New York building. And every Monday night he would have songwriters over to his apartment, and he'd cook some vegetarian pasta meals in a huge bowl, and you could bring a bottle of wine, and you had to bring a brand new song.
Every week.
Not something that you've been polishing and doing at shows and workshopping, but like he wanted new material every single week. Once in a while, he'd humor you. If you brought a song in and he gave you a lot of notes on it, he'd humor you to bring it back one more time and like, now it's right. He didn't like open tunings on the guitar. He said, you got to play in missionary tuning. And he didn't like people to bring guitars because his apartment was so small that if 10 people showed up with guitar cases, it would be like a fire hazard or something. So he had to play his guitar, which is this cool old, Martin D28 or something. And so the evening would start with a meal and then wine, and then eventually we'd all kind of get in a circle and everybody would pass the guitar and sing their new song, and he'd give you some...
Would he be the only one giving notes, or was it encouraged for everybody to give notes?
It was encouraged, but I would say it was nice in that people rarely would give notes just to say something. It wasn't like that where like people were making stuff up just to have something to say. If they had nothing to say, they'd just nod and smile. But they would give notes if there was something constructive. And so I did that for a little while. I mean, there were people that did that for years. I was just kind of an interloper in that scene. But that was part of the seed of what became Song Club. I wanted to do that every week and write a new song every week. But I also wanted to open it up to people who weren't necessarily in New York. So I invited Charlie Wood, who was, I think, already in London at that time, and a few other people, and then a lot of local people like Joe and Doug Wamble.
Mm-hmm.
And so here was my method. I said, every week I'm going to send a title on Thursday, and it was maybe 10 or 12 people, and you had to turn the song in by the end of Sunday night. And I thought, what's the worst that could happen? It could just be me. But if it's just me, I'm writing a song and I'm accountable to these other people. And it turned out to be like Christmas every Sunday for a whole year. I wrote 52 songs in a year, which I didn't think I was capable of. And I got to hear amazing songs by Doug Wamble, by Charlie Wood, by Joe.
And were you the only one receiving all of them, or was everybody hearing all of them?
We were receiving all of them. It was before Dropbox. I think we were using Mobile Me or whatever. Yeah. So they would just go into a folder, and so everybody would submit a lyric sheet and some kind of MP3, and it would literally range from stuff people had recorded on their iPhones to people who were actually pretty good with Logic. Yep. And like Wamble, God bless him, he'd get a title, and like within an hour, this not only would the song be written, but he would have like a demo with drum loops and stuff. I don't know how he did it. One time he told me he was like traveling and he had to record the vocal to meet the deadline. So he was in an airplane bathroom. He actually went in the bathroom with his laptop and he'd been doing all the programming in his seat, but to do the vocal, he took his laptop in and did a vocal at 30,000 feet.
Beautiful.
And, a year later, all of us, I had 52 songs and many other folks did too. And I went from that guy looking in the mirror, like, are you a songwriter? To suddenly, like, now I'd written more songs than I could even remember.
I've always said I'm interested in the intersection of life and work. And these stories from Joe, Doug, and Adam were all perfect examples of how our work is affected by our life experience. Art and craft serve one another. I really got a sense from Adam that there were spheres of influence, and seemingly small gestures among like-minded people can put real work into motion. And it was almost biblical. This song club begat that song club, which begat this record or that lyric. I saw how history was made in small increments and by small groups of people. This was also an example of how my own personal thinking about the craft of songwriting was altered through the podcast conversations. My mind started to open, and it opened even more when Adam told me about Linda Berry, the cartoonist and educator from Wisconsin, of all places, who had taught him about creativity and practice.
I took 2 classes that really changed. So one of them was with a writer named Linda Berry. I don't know if you know her.
I know that name.
She now teaches, I think, in Madison, but she's not from there. She's a creative writing teacher, and she used to draw this cartoon called Ernie Pook's Comique. And she has a great novel, my favorite novel, I think. It's called Cruddy. It's a great novel.
I'll have to look her up when I go home, man.
Yeah, she's great. And so I took a class with her in San Francisco. She was for a little while doing this kind of workshop, and she would take it around and she would teach it in different places. And it was just about, she had written this book called What It Is. It's about creative writing. And so she had these certain kind of exercises, a lot of which had to do with just timed writing, like set a timer for 7 minutes and just keep your pen moving. And you'd have 2 pieces of paper. You'd have your page that you're actually writing your story on, and then she said, if you hit a wall, then just doodle, just
keep
draw
the pen
circles.
moving.
Yeah, just literally spirals. We draw spirals, and then when your brain kicked in again, you'd start writing again. And she would do a few things to kind of prime that moment. It wasn't just like you go in cold and set a timer. She had this poem by Rumi that she loved to read. It was called "The Diver's Clothes on the Shore" or something like that, which I wish I could recite from memory. It's incredible. I read it sometimes just to get myself going. But she would do these exercises where she'd say, okay, think of your parents, think of the first car you can remember that your parents had, and just have a memory of that. And then now in this moment, look around you. Like, what time of day does it seem to be? What season does it seem to be? If you look up, what do you see? If you look down, what do you see? Is anybody else with you right now? And if they're not, is anybody going to be coming into the picture, or has somebody left the picture? She has this real conviction that memory and imagery are very closely connected. She says, that's really what you remember. And so many songwriters, when they're starting out, write about feelings. I feel sad, I feel happy, whatever. And it wasn't a songwriting class, but in her creative writing class, she was saying, don't do that. Just use imagery. Really paint the picture and let people feel, the feelings will be there even if you don't put them in. And that really hit me. She would just give us these things that she had cut out of magazines, like, look at this page for 2 minutes and then write for 7 minutes. So we even got the exercise of not just using our own memory, but taking an image, a pre-existing image.
Yeah, it seems so connected to empathy also, to be able to put yourself in the skin of somebody else or in somebody else's head.
Incredibly, not long after talking to Adam, I was invited to a University of Wisconsin alumni event at a fancy apartment in Manhattan where the guest of honor was none other than Lynda Barry. And I was thrilled at the idea of possibly meeting her. It was on a cold night in February. My wife Amanda, our daughter Sol, and I had just flown back from Mexico a couple of nights before. And while we were on the airplane landing in New York, Sol, who's 10 today, but she was probably 6 or 7 when this happened, drew a very cool picture of buildings and cars, a setting sun, and she wrote in big letters across the top of the page, "This is Night in Brooklyn." I thought that picture was so fantastic and clearly a sign of her creative genius, of course. So a few nights later at the Wisconsin alumni event, I approached Lynda Barry and showed her a photo on my phone of the drawing. Lynda looked at it and said to me, "Aren't you a musician? Why don't you write a song based on the drawing?" Then I understood what Adam Levy meant when he said that a cartoonist had been the best teacher of songwriting that he ever knew. I went home and I wrote "This is Night in Brooklyn," which is on the record.
Take a bite in Brooklyn. You and I are cooking, feeling so good looking in Brooklyn, in Brooklyn. And the stars are shining bright and brilliantly for you and me. And the moon is hanging high for everyone to see. Windows light up Brooklyn.
One night around that same time, I went to Barbès, my favorite club in my neighborhood, to hear Adam Levy play, and I ran into Joe Lawry there. She mentioned that she was going to restart the song club again with Adam. I begged her instantly to include me. I wanted to belong to that community so badly, and I made it very clear. So when the first email was sent out from Joe explaining how the club would work, my body was electric with excitement. It was my chance to be a part of one of those spheres of influence. Every other week, Joe sent a prompt, a word or a phrase that we would use to light the spark of a song. It didn't need to be the title of the song. It could just be used to help get things moving. I wrote a song nearly every 2 weeks for a year for Joe's song club, and when eventually she got too busy to keep it going, I took it over, and I ran it for another 2 years. The community shifted, people came and went, but I was still there holding on to it as a practice, and so were some of my friends. And when I ran out of steam running it, it was taken over by one of my best friends and one of the finest, most underappreciated songwriters I know, Joy Dragland. A good handful of the songs on The Art of Conversation came out of Joy's era of Song Club, and most of the tracks on the record were actually the demos that I made for those songs. For example, her prompt, "Dirty Fingernails," would inspire my song, "Body and the Brain."
The tip of the tongue, the curve of the spine, the breath in the lung, underneath the fingernail, in the front of the chest, the back of the mind, from the top of the crest to the tip of the tail is flowing through your veins.
The prompt, "Pop," would inspire a song by the same name, written about my grandfather.
On the train, he remembered everybody's name, told the jokes, all the way to the final stop. Through the door, he walked 1,000 miles, strained to force a smile as they called out "Pop." In the room where they would gather was a painting of a rather lonely clown looking down in the silence they created.
The prompt, "Vanish," inspired the song Northern Lights, dedicated to Joy Dragland on the eve of her departure from New York to start a new life in Norway.
I've been trying to think of what I can give you, trying to find the right words to say before you have gotten up and you vanished, before you have taken yourself away.
The prompt enough would inspire Georgette, loosely about Georgette Magritte, wife and muse to the painter René Magritte, and surprisingly, not the first song written about her. Paul Simon beat me to the punch in 1983.
In love, you never had enough, but somehow rose above and moved beyond the dead. Georgette, every vivid hue and every sun that sets, I will think of you.
And the prompt Bottle of Wine in February 2020 inspired the song Trying Times.
I can tell something's on your mind. Oh well, these are trying times. So raise your glass and drink your wine, 'cause nothing lasts, not even trying times. These are trying times. These are trying. These are trying times. These are trying times.
These recordings were influenced not only by the Song Club, but also by the select musicians who I called to fill them out. I turned to my teachers, some of those masterful musicians who had imparted all that wisdom to me on the podcast. Ricky Peterson played organ on Georgette. In the case of pop, it was Orlando Fleming on bass, Anya Marina singing with me, and Ryan Keberle playing the trombone choir. And in the case of Trying Times, there was one thing I knew. I wanted Larry Goldings to play organ on it. And this was just at the end of the before times, when if you wanted to talk to somebody, you could actually just go out and try to find them, back in early 2020. So I went out to track him down at a gig he was playing at Smalls in the Village and asked him if he would play on my song.
Larry Goldings on Hammond 3.
As it turned out, that was the last gig I went to before COVID, on Tuesday, February 25th, 2020. Larry was playing with my friend and also another former guest of the podcast, John Scrapper Snyder. Maybe because it was the last time I was in a club like that, I have a strong memory of the night. I sat right behind Larry up against the wall and elbow to elbow with some European kid. We all had our winter gear with us, which meant every extra inch of the club was occupied with scarves and parkas, and the room was hot, humid. I drank seltzer. I don't know why, but I did. The legendary Andy Bay sat in on vocals. This is a recording of that night. After the show was over, a line of people formed to talk to Larry. Because even though he still kind of belongs to New York, he has in fact lived in LA for years, so every time he makes an appearance, it's an event. But I got my minute with him to explain about my song, and he was immediately very encouraging. He said he'd be back in town a couple months later and we could do it then. But I probably don't need to tell you that is not what happened. 2 weeks later, the world shut down. And we all transitioned. The podcast transitioned. I started doing the interviews long distance. And it worked out. Instead of schlepping, scheduling, setting up all those delicate logistics, I discovered I could talk to people all over the world and easily. Noga Erez in Israel, Ron Sexsmith in Ontario, Curtis Steigers in Idaho, Imogen Heap in London, Rick Beato in Atlanta, S.G. Goodman in Kentucky, Roxana Ahmed in Miami, Boz Skaggs in San Francisco, Andres Levine in Cuba. I mean, really, these are all interviews that would not have happened if not for COVID and social distancing. And my record transition, too. The first things first, from his home in L.A., Larry Goldings played that beautiful organ part on Trying Times. I discovered there was enormous potential in this isolation, both for remote recording and for some seriously homespun production too. So while Larry was busy putting his keyboards on the track, I convinced Amanda to sing the song as a duet with me. It seemed to capture the spirit of the song and of the time.
Love is a wondrous feeling, keeps you warm at night. I can tell.
The next move I made was a little more ambitious. Years ago, when I interviewed Jorge Drexler, I told you the story on this podcast of how I came to co-produce the song Al Otro Lado del Rio, which was written and performed by Drexler. Al Otro Lado made history when it won an Oscar in 2005. When I moved from Madison to Brooklyn later that same year, the song was the horse I rode in on. It changed my life. Ever since then, I wondered how I might adapt that song, both lyrically from Spanish to English and musically from its original folkloric rhythm to something more North American, more rooted in Americana or the blues. By spring of 2019, I did have a working adaptation of the song into English that I was performing on tour in Europe. Here I am doing it in Victoria, Spain in May of that year.
I put my blade in the water, hold on to both of our oars. I think that I see a light just on the other shore.
And in early March of 2020, right around the time when I was recording Trying Times, I went to my friend Michael Sackler-Berner's newly constructed studio in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn, and I recorded the basic tracks for what would become my version of the song called Row On. Michael helped me to figure out the approach and coached me gently through singing a couple of takes of the vocal. And that was it. We agreed to get together again a couple weeks later to keep working on it, but of course, it would be many months before we were in the same room again. When COVID showed up, the song began to take on a new significance for me. It always represented a kind of resilience and hope. The original lyric translates as, "I think I see a light on the other side of the river." But something about the translation to English, when the mood met the moment, evoked solidarity and perseverance, and I knew that I wanted to reach out to friends around the world to sing on it with me. I actually started locally, reaching out to friends from Song Club, then folks from further afield. And former podcast guests, too. People who sat somewhere in that space between colleagues and compatriots, but whose generosity and goodwill I knew I could count on. And speaking of goodwill, one of the first calls I found myself making, once again, was to Will Lee, who sang on the song from his secret hideout in the Caribbean. Then other guests from whom I had learned so many things, like Kurt Elling, Becca Stevens, and Andre de Shields. I had the ever-stoked John Fields mix it, as he did much of the record. And of course I reached out to Joe Lawry and Doug Wamble, who had delivered the dream of Song Club to me in the first place, to sing also. As the song expanded, I tried to share my progress with Jorge Drexler, who lives in Madrid, but he was silent. So I kept going, calling on members of his musical family in Spain and South America, who have become friends to me too, like Kevin Johansen in Argentina, Javier Ruibal and Antonio Lizana in Spain, Alexandra Cassin in Brazil. I wanted to pay some tribute to Jorge, and when he finally saw the video, I wanted him to know that we were thinking of him wherever he was. All told, the chorus swelled to include 40 singers from around the world, and just as I was about to finish it up, Jorge emerged from his silence. He had been down for the count himself with COVID. But when he heard the version and saw the video with all the singers, he offered to sing the song as a duet with me.
Down on this edge of the earth, what doesn't kill you ignore. I think that I see a light just on the other shore.
There's another kind of cool anecdote here too. Back when I was still working on my original arrangement of the song, on that tour in Spain when I was working out Row On in public, I went to perform on a radio show in Madrid. I was hanging out with my French musicians, I call them my groovy French band, in the green room at Radio Nacional, waiting to perform and promote our show that night. And there was another musical act on the same show with us that day, an American singer named Betty Smith, who brought a couple of the musicians from her band with her. There was a guitar player and a trumpet player, and these dudes walked in looking pretty slick. They looked like the Cats. Look, I don't know you. I don't know your life, but maybe you know what I mean when I say they looked like the Cats. It wasn't just that they were wearing the hip hats. It was the way they wore them. It was their shoes. It was the way they kind of eyed the whole scene, brought their luggage with them into the radio station. They seemed exhausted. The whole energy from these guys, it was like, these were the Cats. I made small talk because, you know, it's what I do. And one of these guys looks at me and says, "Are you the guy from the podcast? I recognize your voice. We were just talking about you earlier today." Man, I get chills just thinking about that. But that's how I met Michael Sarian, who plays trumpet on the opening song of the record, Wake Up So-So. I never interviewed him, but the podcast brought us together all the same.
It's time to start the show. Time to start the show. Time to start the show. Time to start that show. Time to start that show.
When I first heard Kat Edmonson sing, I was really excited. It was her hipness and her humor, her style and her classic aesthetic. She's a self-proclaimed old-fashioned gal, but in the context of the world today, it comes across as oddly modern. In early 2020, I reached out to her team to see about doing an interview, and while I was waiting for it to be formalized, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to go see her play at the Winter Jazz Fest in New York, determined to talk to her after the show. A handful of friends were in the crowd, including Amy Cervini of Duchess, who had talked about the value of entertaining an audience, and Matt Munisteri, who was actually playing guitar in Kat's band. You know, Matt Munisteri from the unreleased Awkward Laughter episode I told you about. So I hung out after the set and waited for an introduction, and Matt and Amy obliged. I was presented to Kat, and I made my case for why we had to do an episode together. A week later, she came over, and we talked for a couple of hours on the record and a couple more off the record. She has a quiet, patient, determined energy that I just loved.
I have a lot to learn about just being still and just being. If you go outside and look at a beautiful tree, and it's not like scheming about how it's going to stand out among the other trees, and it's not worrying about how it's going to be a tree tomorrow. It's not, there's a lot of things it's not doing, but there's this thing, this life force inside of it that also exists inside of me, that's functioning entirely on its own. Growth and healing or whatever is happening entirely independent of my making it so, and I think being in touch with that, whatever that is, allows me to also be very close to my creative self. In that I know that my when I write a song, I don't set out to write a song. They ask to be written.
I heard you say that on stage. You know you're writing a song when you start singing a song you've never heard before.
Yeah. And where does that come from? I don't know, but I want to respect it and honor it and make as much space for it as possible.
Mm-hmm. As soon as she left that day, I picked up the guitar and started singing a song that I had never heard before. It was a way of carrying our conversation into the creative space. I always imagined Kat singing it. Really, I wrote it for her. I didn't know it would become the linchpin of my project. I didn't know it was the missing piece. I just thought, wouldn't it be cool to hear Kat Edmonson singing this song? So you can imagine how I feel every time I hear her singing this song with me on my record.
Ping, the buzz, the zap, the rush of validation. Remember, it's a trap to try and draw you in. So to cut through all the noise, to sift through all the static, put away the toys, settle and begin.
No matter what your age
or your affiliation,
let yourself engage
in the art of conversation.
The art of conversation. Excuse me while I take this call.
I don't know if art imitates life, if life imitates art, or if it's all just kind of happening all the time and we call it what we call it, when we call it, what we call it. I do know that I'm a better person because of these conversations. I know that I'm a better person because of the practice of making this podcast. And I know that I'm a better songwriter because of what I've learned here. And I know that words matter, what we say matters, and conversations matter. There it was, my friends, the art of conversation. Big ups to all the Third Story guests who appear on the record. Victoria Canal, Louis Cato, Philip Dizak, Jorge Drexler, Andre DeShields, Joy Dragland, Kurt Elling, Kat Edmonson, John Ellis, John Fields, Larry Goldings, Alan Hampton, Morgan James, Joe Lawry, Will Lee, Daniel Leviton, Orlando Fleming, Howard Levy, Ryan Keberle, Anya Marina, Ricky Peterson, Michael Sackler-Berner, Amanda Sidran, Ben Sidran, Sol Sidran, Scrapper Snyder, Becca Stevens, JJ Telesforo, Michael Thurber, Butch Vig, and Doug Wamble. And big love to the rest of the contributors to the album who still have yet to make their Third Story appearance. Camille Berteau, Claire Burson, Carlos Campi Campon, Javier Kalecki, Matthias Cella, Clementine, Max Darman, Robert DiPietro, Al Falashi, Lauren Henderson, Kevin Johansson, Cassine, Michael Sarian, Antonio Serrano, David Snyder, Joanna Teeters, Tim Whalen, Bo Vig, and Nina Zeitlin. And thanks to you for the chance to spend some time together. I'll be back again in your headspace before you know it. Michael Bland, Philip Lassiter, Michael Mayo, and Julian Lage are all on deck this month, and they're all really beautiful talks that I can't wait for you to hear, and I can't wait to include them into the great sphere of influence. In the meantime, here's Together With You, featuring none other than Tatum Greenblatt on trumpet. You know, the first guy I ever interviewed. I'll talk to you soon.
Together